Blood streaked down Elara's back in crimson rivulets as the 20th lash tore through her already shredded skin. And when her knees finally buckled against the stone floor of the arena, the crowd's roar turned to stunned silence as a figure in midnight black emerged from the shadows. Kieran Ashworth, the alpha vampire himself, his ancient eyes blazing with fury as he swept her broken form into his arms and carried her past 1,000 gasping spectators who had never seen their immortal lord show mercy to a human slave. Wait, before the next revelation happens, if this mystery has already captivated you, let us know where you're following this story from. To make sure you don't miss any unexpected alliances or awakened powers, subscribe and join our circle. The game is about to change. Now, back to the scene. The arena fell into an unnatural hush, broken only by the sound of Kieran's boots against stone as he strode toward the exit with Elara's limp form pressed against his chest. Her dark hair spilled over his arm like spilled ink, and her breathing came in shallow, labored gasps that seemed to echo in the vast circular chamber. The spectators, vampires, werewolves, and various supernatural beings who had gathered for the monthly punishment ceremonies, remained frozen in their seats, their conversations dying mid-sentence. "My lord," stammered Marcus Thorne, the arena's overseer, his pale hands trembling as he approached. "The sentence hasn't been completed. She still owes 15 lashes for her transgression." Kieran stopped walking, but didn't turn around. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries and the promise of death. "Touch her again, and I will ensure your existence ends in ways that will make the humans' medieval tortures seem like gentle caresses." The overseer stumbled backward, his face draining of what little color it held. Around the arena, murmurs began to ripple through the crowd like water disturbed by a stone. No one could remember the last time Kieran Ashworth had intervened in a punishment ceremony, let alone carried away a human slave in his arms. Elara's consciousness flickered between darkness and painful awareness. She could feel the steady rhythm of powerful steps beneath her, could smell something like cedar and storm clouds, could sense an otherworldly strength in the arms that held her. But the agony radiating from her back made coherent thought nearly impossible. Her last clear memory was of being dragged into the arena, accused of stealing bread from the vampire nobles' kitchens to feed the sick children in the human quarters. The accusation had been true. She had stolen the bread, just as she had stolen medicine, blankets, and countless other necessities over the past 3 years. But she had never been caught before, never been dragged before the Council of Shadows to receive judgment. The trial had lasted less than 10 minutes. 35 lashes, they had decreed. 35 lashes for theft, to be administered publicly as a warning to other human servants who might consider similar acts of rebellion. She had endured 20 before her body gave out completely. Now, as Kieran carried her through corridors she had never seen before, wide passages lined with ancient tapestries and lit by floating orbs of cold fire, Elara struggled to understand what had happened. Why had the most powerful vampire in the realm, a being whose very presence could silence rooms and whose word was absolute law, intervened on behalf of a human slave? They passed through massive doors that swung open at Kieran's approach, revealing chambers that seemed to exist in another world entirely. The walls here were not the rough stone of the servant quarters, but smooth obsidian that reflected the firelight like black mirrors. Furniture that looked centuries old but perfectly maintained filled the spaces, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with barely contained power. Kieran moved with purpose through this domain until he reached a chamber dominated by a massive four-poster bed draped in midnight blue silk. With surprising gentleness, he laid Ilara face down on the coverlet, her torn dress barely clinging to her shoulders. "Don't move," he commanded, though his tone had lost its earlier edge of lethal fury. "I'm going to tend to your wounds." Ilara tried to speak, tried to ask why he was helping her, but only a weak whisper emerged. I don't understand." "Understanding isn't required," Kieran replied, moving to a cabinet filled with bottles and vials that gleamed like captured starlight. He returned with a cloth soaked in something that smelled of moonflowers and rain. When he began to clean the wounds on her back, Ilara bit down on the silk beneath her face to keep from crying out. The liquid stung at first, then began to cool the burning pain in a way that seemed almost magical. "You're probably wondering why I intervened," Kieran said as he worked, his hands steady and surprisingly gentle for someone who commanded armies of the undead. "The truth is, I've been watching you for some time, Ilara Blackwood." She turned her head slightly, enough to see him from the corner of her eye. Up close, he was even more imposing than the glimpses she had caught during formal ceremonies. His face could have been carved from marble by a master sculptor. Sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw, eyes the color of storm clouds that seemed to hold depths she couldn't fathom. His dark hair was pulled back, revealing the elegant line of his neck, and when he moved, it was with the fluid grace of a predator who had never known defeat. "You know my name?" she whispered. "I know many things about you." He applied more of the healing solution to a particularly deep cut, and she gasped despite herself. "I know you've been stealing from the nobles' quarters for 3 years. I know you've saved 17 children from starvation and disease. I know you read books by candlelight in storage rooms, that you speak 4 languages, and that you have a mind sharper than most of the creatures who consider themselves your betters." Ilara's breath caught. If he knew all of this, then he had been watching her far longer and far more closely than she could have imagined. But why? What could a human slave possibly offer to interest the alpha vampire, a being who had ruled the supernatural world for over 8 centuries? "I also know," Kieran continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "that you carry something within you that makes you far more valuable than you realize. Something that certain members of my council would kill to possess, and others would kill to destroy." Before she could ask what he meant, the chamber doors burst open with a crash that made the floating orbs of fire flicker. 3 figures strode in without invitation, 2 vampires and a woman whose very presence seemed to make the shadows deeper. "Kieran," the first vampire spoke, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Lord Damien Ravencrest," Ilara realized with a jolt of fear. She had seen him at court ceremonies, had heard the servants whisper about his cruelty and his ambition. What is the meaning of this display? The woman beside him, tall, elegant, with silver hair that seemed to move of its own accord, smiled with lips that had never known warmth. Lady Seraphina Nightfall, the High Witch of the Northern Covens and Kieran's closest advisor. Her presence here could mean nothing good. "I wasn't aware I needed permission to tend to an injured servant," Kieran replied without looking up from his work on Ilara's wounds. But she could feel the tension in his hands, could sense the power beginning to gather around him like a storm preparing to break. "Come now." Lord Damien stepped closer, his pale eyes fixed on Ilara's prone form. "We both know she's no ordinary servant." The augury stones have been singing for weeks, speaking of a human who carries the potential to upset the balance of power in our world. A human who could either be our salvation or our destruction. Ilara's blood ran cold. She didn't understand what they were talking about, but the way they spoke about her, as if she were an object to be claimed or eliminated, made her skin crawl with more than just physical pain. "The girl has untapped power," Lady Seraphina added, her voice like silk wrapped around steel. "Power that, in the wrong hands, could tear apart the treaty that has kept peace between our species for 3 centuries. She needs to be properly contained." Kieran's hand stilled on Ilara's back. When he spoke, his voice carried a warning that made the temperature in the room drop several degrees. "She is under my protection." "Your protection?" The third figure spoke for the first time. A vampire Ilara didn't recognize, though his bearing suggested nobility. "Since when do you concern yourself with protecting humans, my lord? Especially humans who have committed crimes against your own people?" "Since now." Kieran finally turned to face them, and Ilara saw his expression reflected in the obsidian walls. His features had taken on an inhuman beauty that was terrible to behold, his eyes now glowing with an inner light that promised swift death to anyone who challenged him. "And I would suggest you remember who you're speaking to." But Lord Damien was not so easily cowed. "The Council has voted, Kieran. The human presents too great a risk to be left free. She will be contained in the Tower of Silence until we can determine the full extent of her abilities and decide how best to utilize them." The Tower of Silence. Ilara heard whispers of that place, a prison where supernatural beings who posed threats to the established order were kept in magical stasis, sometimes for decades, sometimes forever. The thought of being trapped there, conscious but unable to move or speak, filled her with a terror that dwarfed her physical pain. "The Council," Kieran said softly, "serves at my pleasure. They do not dictate to me." "Times change," Lady Seraphina interjected, her silver hair now moving in patterns that hurt to look at directly, even for alpha vampires. The old ways of absolute rule are giving way to more collaborative approaches. The Council represents the will of all our people, not just your personal preferences." Ilara realized she was witnessing something unprecedented, a challenge to Kieran's authority from within his own inner circle. The political implications were staggering, but more immediately terrifying was what this meant for her own survival. If Kieran's power was being questioned, then his protection might not be enough to save her. "You overreach," Kieran said, and now his voice carried the sound of winter winds and distant thunder. "All of you." "Do we?" Lord Damien smiled, revealing fangs that gleamed like polished ivory. "Or are we simply adapting to new realities? The humans grow stronger each year, develop new technologies, new weapons. The werewolf clans grow restless with the peace accords. The witch covens whisper of prophecies that speak of great changes coming. In such times, personal attachments become liabilities." "You speak of her as if she were my attachment." Kieran's hands moved to rest on Ilara's shoulders, and she could feel the protective power in his touch. "You mistake practicality for sentiment." "Then you won't object to turning her over to the Council for proper evaluation?" Lady Seraphina said smoothly. "After all, if she's merely a practical consideration, then allowing the proper authorities to assess her capabilities should pose no problem." Ilara closed her eyes, knowing that her fate was being decided by beings whose motivations she couldn't begin to understand. But beneath the terror, something else was stirring. a warmth that seemed to spread from wherever Kieran's hands touched her skin, and with it, a strength she had never felt before. "I object," Kieran said quietly, "to anyone touching what belongs to me." The words sent a shock through the room that was almost physical. Lord Damien took a step back, his confident smile faltering. Lady Seraphina's silver hair stilled completely, and the unnamed vampire's face went ashen. "Belongs to you?" Lord Damien repeated slowly. "Kieran, surely you don't mean—" "I mean exactly what I said." Kieran turned back to Elara, his hands resuming their gentle ministrations to her wounds. "She is mine, by right of claim and protection. Any who wish to challenge that right are welcome to do so, personally." The challenge in his words was unmistakable, and the three intruders exchanged glances that spoke of hasty recalculations. Challenging Kieran's right to claim something or someone would require formal combat, and no vampire in living memory had survived such a confrontation with the Alpha. But Lady Seraphina was not finished. "Your claim may protect her from council action," she said carefully, "but it doesn't change what she is. The power within her will manifest whether she's in the Tower of Silence or in your chambers. When it does, the consequences will fall on your head. I'll bear that responsibility. And when the other human settlements hear that you've claimed one of their own, when they see it as evidence that we view them as property to be collected, the peace accords will hold," Kieran interrupted, "because I will ensure they hold, just as I will ensure that no harm comes to Elara while she remains under my protection." The three visitors stood in tense silence for a long moment. Then Lady Seraphina nodded slowly. "Very well. But understand, Kieran, if she becomes a threat to our people, if the power within her proves uncontrollable, the council will act with or without your consent." "They are welcome to try," Kieran replied without looking up. After the intruders departed, the chamber fell into silence, broken only by the soft sound of Elara's breathing and the gentle clink of glass as Kieran worked with his healing supplies. The immediate threat had passed, but Elara's mind raced with questions and implications. What power had they spoken of? Why had Kieran claimed her as his property? And what did it mean for her future? "The wounds are healing well," Kieran said finally. His voice returned to its earlier gentleness. "The scarring will be minimal." "Thank you," she whispered, though the words felt inadequate for what he had done. Not just the healing, but the protection, the claiming that had probably saved her life. "Don't thank me yet," he replied, moving to sit in a chair beside the bed where she could see his face without straining. "What I've done tonight has changed everything for both of us. There will be consequences." What did they mean about power within me? I don't understand any of this. Kieran was quiet for a long moment, his storm-gray eyes studying her face. "Tell me, Elara, have you ever experienced anything unusual? Dreams that felt more real than waking life? Moments when you knew things you shouldn't have known? Times when you felt as if you could sense what others were thinking or feeling?" The question sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the cool air of the chamber, because the answer was yes, though she had never spoken of it to anyone. Dreams of places she had never been, but that felt like memories. Moments when she had instinctively known which children were sickest, which medicines would work best, which nobles were planning cruelties before they acted on them. "Sometimes," she admitted quietly, "I thought so." Kieran leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Elara, you are what we call a seer, a human born with the ability to perceive beyond the normal bounds of mortal senses. It's a rare gift, and an extremely valuable one." "Valuable how?" "A true seer can see the threads that connect all living things, can perceive the currents of power that flow through our world, can sometimes even glimpse fragments of possible futures. In the right hands, such abilities could prevent wars, expose conspiracies, save countless lives. And in the wrong hands, Kieran's expression darkened. In the wrong hands, a seer could be used to manipulate those same currents of power, to gain unfair advantages in political maneuverings, to control outcomes that should be left to chance and choice. That's why the Council wants you contained, not just for what you are, but for what you could be made to do. Ilara absorbed this information with growing unease. "And what do you want me to do?" "I want you to choose," he said simply. "You have 3 options as I see them. First, you could allow me to place you under a protection spell that would suppress your abilities completely. You would live a normal human life, but you would never be able to access the power that's growing within you. What's the second option? You could accept training to develop your abilities properly. I would teach you myself, along with others who could help you understand and control what you can do. But that path would mean accepting that you're no longer fully human, that you'll never be able to return to your old life." Ilara's heart clenched at the thought of leaving behind the children in the servant quarters who depended on her, the small community she had built among the other human workers. "And the third option, you could leave," Kieran said quietly, "tonight. I would provide you with resources, transportation, documents that would allow you to start a new life far from here. But you would be on your own, and eventually other supernatural beings would find you. Not all of them would be as interested in your well-being as I am." The weight of the choice settled on her shoulders like a physical burden. Each option meant giving up something essential, either her growing power, her community, or her safety. But as she looked at Kieran's face, she realized there was something else at stake, something he hadn't mentioned. "What happens to you if I choose the first or third option?" she asked. A shadow crossed his features. "That's not your concern." "It is if you've put yourself at risk to protect me. Those people tonight, they weren't just challenging my fate, they were challenging your authority." Kieran was quiet for a moment, then sighed. "You're perceptive. Yes, by claiming you publicly, I've made my own position more precarious. There are those on the Council who believe my methods of rule are outdated, that the supernatural world needs new leadership for changing times. Tonight's intervention will give them ammunition for their cause." "So if I disappear, they win?" "If you disappear, they lose a powerful piece in their political games. Whether they win or lose depends on many factors beyond just your presence." But Ilara could see the truth in his eyes, could sense it through whatever nascent abilities were stirring within her. Her fate and his were now intertwined, and her choices would affect not just her own future, but the balance of power in a world she was only beginning to understand. "I need time to think," she said finally. "Of course. But understand, you have until dawn. After that, the protection of my claim may not be enough to keep the Council from acting unilaterally." Dawn. Ilara looked toward the windows, seeing that the sky was already beginning to lighten in the east. She had perhaps 3 hours to make a decision that would reshape her entire existence. "There's something else you should know," Kieran said, rising from his chair. "The healing solution I used on your wounds contains properties that will accelerate your recovery, but it will also enhance any supernatural abilities you might possess. You may find yourself experiencing things differently over the next few hours." As if summoned by his words, Ilara felt a sudden rush of sensations that made her gasp. The room seemed brighter, more vivid, and she could sense currents of energy flowing through the walls, through Kieran himself, through her own body, in patterns that were both beautiful and overwhelming. "What's happening to me?" "Your true nature is awakening," he replied, moving to the windows and drawing heavy curtains across them. "Try to rest. Tomorrow, Or later today, rather, everything changes. He moved toward the door, but Elara called out to stop him. Kieran, why did you really intervene tonight? And don't tell me it was just because of what I am. You could have any seer, couldn't you? So why me? He paused with his hand on the door handle, his back to her. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight of emotion she hadn't heard before. Because 3 years ago, I watched a human girl risk her own life to steal medicine for a dying child. Not for reward, not for recognition, but simply because it was the right thing to do. And I realized that in 8 centuries of existence, I had never met anyone, vampire, werewolf, witch, or human, with such pure courage and compassion. You've been watching me for 3 years? I've been protecting you for 3 years, he corrected, making sure your small rebellions went unnoticed, ensuring that the children you helped received additional aid through channels they would never trace back to you. Tonight was the first time I couldn't work from the shadows. The revelation left Elara speechless. For 3 years, she had thought herself alone in her struggles, taking risks that terrified her because no one else would help the most vulnerable humans in their community. To learn that someone had not only been watching, but actively helping was almost too much to process. Why didn't you approach me sooner? Kieran finally turned to face her, and in his eyes she saw centuries of loneliness and a vulnerability that his power couldn't mask. Because I knew that the moment I entered your life directly, I would change it forever. And you deserved better than to have your choices taken away by the desires of a creature like me. What desires? The desire, he said quietly, to find someone in this world who could see past the monster to whatever humanity might still exist beneath. The desire to protect something pure and good, instead of constantly battling those who would corrupt or destroy. The desire to hope that even someone like me might be worthy of companionship. The admission hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable in a way that made Elara's chest tight with emotions she couldn't name. Here was the most powerful being in their world, feared by enemies and allies alike, confessing that he was lonely. That he had watched her from afar, not just because of what she could do, but because of who she was. "You're not a monster," she said softly. "I've killed thousands over the centuries. I've made decisions that led to the deaths of thousands more. I rule through fear as much as respect. And there are those who would argue that terror is my most effective tool. And yet you spent 3 years secretly helping sick children because you saw someone trying to do the same thing." Kieran's smile was sad and self-deprecating. "Perhaps that makes me a sentimental monster. Perhaps it makes you someone trying to be better than what the world expects." They looked at each other across the chamber. 2 beings from vastly different worlds who had somehow found themselves connected by circumstances neither had planned. The energy Elara could now sense flowing between them was complex. Attraction, certainly, but also recognition, understanding, and something deeper that she wasn't ready to name. "I should let you rest," Kieran said, finally. "Will you be back? I'll be nearby. If you need anything, simply call my name and I'll hear you." After he left, Elara lay in the magnificent bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to process everything that had happened. The pain in her back had faded to a dull ache, and she could feel strength returning to her body with unnatural speed. But it was the changes in her perception that truly unsettled her. She could sense life forces throughout the vast mansion, the bright, quick energies of human servants, the deeper, more complex patterns of supernatural beings, and threading through it all, Kieran's presence like a steady flame that seemed to call to something within her own soul. When she closed her eyes, she could almost see the connections between all living things, silver threads that pulsed with information and emotion. Was this what it meant to be a seer? To perceive the hidden currents that flowed beneath the surface of reality? If so, it was both exhilarating and terrifying. She could understand why some would want to harness such abilities and why others would fear them. As dawn approached, Ilara found herself thinking not just about her own choices, but about Kieran's position. He had ruled the supernatural world for centuries, maintaining a delicate balance between species that had historically been enemies. Now that balance is being challenged from within his own council, and her presence had given his opponents a weapon to use against him. If she chose to suppress her abilities and return to a normal life, would that weaken his position further? If she chose to leave, would she be abandoning someone who had protected her when no one else would? And if she chose training, would she be able to become strong enough to be an asset rather than a liability? The questions multiplied as the sky lightened, and with them came a growing certainty that her decision would affect far more than just her own future. Like it or not, she had become a piece in a game much larger than herself, and the moves she made now would ripple through the supernatural world in ways she couldn't predict. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps being a seer meant accepting that her choices would have consequences she couldn't foresee, and trusting in her own moral compass to guide her toward the right path. By the time Kieran returned, bringing with him a tray of food and fresh clothes, Ilara had made her decision. "I want the training," she said, before he could speak. He set the tray down carefully, his expression unreadable. "You understand what that means? There's no going back once you start down that path." "I understand that children are still dying in the servant quarters while politicians play games with people's lives," she replied, accepting the simple dress he offered and moving behind a screen to change. "I understand that you've been fighting to maintain peace for centuries, and now you're facing challenges from people who would rather seize power than preserve stability. And I understand that running away or hiding won't solve any of those problems." "Training a seer is dangerous," Kieran warned as she emerged in the new dress, simple but well-made, far finer than anything she had worn before. "The process of awakening your full abilities could drive you mad if not handled carefully. And once you can see clearly, you'll perceive truths about our world that you may wish you could forget." "Then I'll have to be strong enough to handle those truths," Ilara replied, sitting at the small table where he had placed the food. "Besides, I don't think ignorance is really an option anymore, is it? Even if I chose to suppress my abilities, I'd still know what I was giving up, still know that there was more I could be doing to help people." Kieran nodded slowly, though she could sense his continued concern through whatever connection was growing between them. "The training will take months, possibly years. You'll need to stay close to me during that time, for your protection and to ensure your development remains stable. That means living here, in my mansion, as part of my household." "As your property?" The words came out more sharply than she had intended, and she saw him flinch. "As my ward, under my protection. The legal distinction may seem minor, but in our world it means everything. A ward has rights that a claimed possession does not." "And what rights would those be?" "The right to refuse training if it becomes too much to bear. The right to leave if you choose, though I would strongly advise against it until your abilities are fully developed and controlled. The right to speak freely without fear of punishment. And," he hesitated, then met her eyes directly, "the right to develop whatever relationship between us feels natural and honest, without coercion or obligation." The last point made heat rise in Ilara's cheeks, though she wasn't sure if it was from embarrassment or something else. The attraction she felt toward Kieran was undeniable, but it was complicated by the vast differences in their stations and the circumstances that had brought them together. "And your rights?" she asked. "What do you gain from this arrangement, besides a potential political liability?" Kieran smiled, and for the first time since she had met him, the expression reached his eyes. The chance to see what you become when given the freedom to reach your full potential. The opportunity to learn from someone whose moral clarity hasn't been clouded by centuries of compromise and necessary cruelties. And perhaps the companionship of someone who chooses to be in my presence rather than being compelled by fear or obligation. It was, Ilara realized, as honest an answer as she could hope for. There was attraction between them, but he wasn't trying to use their situation to force anything. There was mutual benefit, but he wasn't pretending his motives were purely altruistic. And there was genuine respect, something she hadn't expected from someone of his power and position. "Then let's begin," she said, reaching for a piece of fruit from the tray. "What's the first lesson?" "The first lesson," Kieran replied, settling into the chair across from her, "is learning to shield your mind. Right now, your thoughts and emotions are broadcasting to anyone with the ability to sense them. That makes you vulnerable and limits your ability to gather information without being detected." Someone could read my thoughts? A skilled telepath could, yes. And while I'm not a mind reader in the traditional sense, I can feel the general tone of your emotions through the connection that's developed between us. That explained the sense of warmth and safety she felt whenever he was near, and the way his moods seemed to echo in her own consciousness. How do I shield myself? Close your eyes and try to visualize your mind as a room. Picture the walls, the doors, the windows. Make it as detailed as you can. Ilara did as instructed, imagining a library not unlike one she had seen in an illustrated book years before. High ceilings, tall windows, shelves lined with leather-bound volumes. Good. I can sense that you've created the space. Now imagine curtains over the windows, bars on the doors, ways to control what enters and what leaves your mental sanctuary. As she worked on the visualization, Ilara began to understand how her nascent abilities functioned. The mental shield wasn't just about privacy. It was about creating a stable foundation from which to extend her consciousness outward in controlled ways. Without it, her perceptions would be chaotic and overwhelming. "Better," Kieran said after several minutes of practice. "The connection between us is still there, but muted. With time, you'll learn to modulate it, opening it when you want to share thoughts or emotions, closing it when you need privacy." They worked on shielding techniques for over an hour until Ilara could maintain her mental barriers without constant concentration. It was exhausting work, requiring a level of focus she had never needed before, but also strangely exhilarating. Each small success made her feel more in control of the abilities that had been awakening within her. "That's enough for now," Kieran said finally. "You need rest, and I have council business to attend to. Tonight, we'll work on extending your perceptions in controlled ways, learning to sense the emotional states of others without being overwhelmed by them." "Will the council meeting be about me?" "Partially. Lord Damien and Lady Seraphina will undoubtedly raise concerns about your presence here, and I'll need to address those concerns while maintaining the political balance that keeps our various species from returning to open warfare." "I'm sorry," Ilara said impulsively. "I never wanted to cause problems for you." Kieran paused in gathering up the empty dishes, his hands stilling. "Ilara, in 8 centuries of existence, you are the first person to apologize for causing me political difficulties. Do you understand how remarkable that is? I know you took a risk protecting me. It doesn't seem right that you should suffer for it. I took that risk because I believe you're worth protecting. Don't apologize for being worthy of the sacrifice." After he left, Ilara tried to rest as instructed, but sleep proved elusive. The mental shielding exercises had left her simultaneously drained and energized, and her heightened perceptions made it difficult to ignore the various life forces she could sense throughout the mansion. More troubling were the occasional flashes of what might have been visions, brief glimpses of scenes that felt both foreign and familiar. In one, she saw herself standing in a great hall, addressing a gathering of supernatural beings with confidence she had never possessed. In another, she witnessed a battle between creatures of shadow and light, with herself somehow standing at the center of the conflict. The images were fragmentary and confusing, but they left her with a sense that her future held challenges she couldn't yet imagine. When evening came, Kieran returned to find her pacing the chamber, too restless to remain still. "The visions have started," he observed, settling into his usual chair. "You knew they would? It's part of the awakening process. Your consciousness is beginning to perceive potential futures, not fixed destinies, but possibilities based on current trajectories. They'll become clearer and more reliable as your training progresses. In one of them, I was speaking to a crowd of supernatural beings. That seems unlikely." Kieran's expression grew thoughtful. "Perhaps less unlikely than you imagine. Tell me what you saw." Ilara described the vision in detail, noting how the assembled creatures had seemed to be listening respectfully rather than viewing her as a curiosity or threat. Kieran nodded slowly as she spoke, his storm-gray eyes growing distant. "The Hall of Accords," he said when she finished. "That's where the major treaties between our species were signed 3 centuries ago. If you saw yourself speaking there, it suggests you may play a role in future negotiations or diplomatic events. But I'm human. What could I possibly contribute to supernatural diplomacy?" "Objectivity," Kieran replied simply. "You have no ancestral grudges against any particular species, no inherited territorial disputes, no cultural biases that favor one group over another. A seer with such neutrality could serve as a mediator in ways that someone born into our political hierarchies never could." The possibility both intrigued and terrified Ilara. She had spent her life as one of the powerless, someone whose opinions mattered to no one beyond her small circle of fellow servants. The thought of potentially influencing decisions that affected entire species was overwhelming. "But that's far in the future, if it happens at all," Kieran continued. "For now, we need to focus on developing your control and understanding. Are you ready for tonight's lesson?" They worked on extending her perceptions gradually, learning to sense the emotional states of others without being overwhelmed by the intensity of their feelings. It was delicate work. Too little focus, and she perceived nothing beyond her own thoughts. Too much, and she risked losing herself in the chaotic swirl of emotions from every living being within miles. "Feel for my emotional state," Kieran instructed, sitting perfectly still across from her. "But maintain your shields. Don't let my feelings become your own." Ilara reached out carefully with her consciousness, immediately sensing the complex layers of Kieran's emotional landscape. There was concern for her well-being, satisfaction at her rapid progress, and beneath it all, a deep loneliness that made her chest ache with sympathy. "I can feel it," she whispered. "You're worried about me, but also sad. Why are you sad?" Kieran's expression didn't change, but she felt a flicker of surprise through their connection. "You're more perceptive than I expected. The sadness is old. It comes from centuries of necessary isolation, of making decisions that preserve peace but cost lives, of watching mortals I've grown fond of age and die, while I remain unchanged." "You've cared for other humans before?" "A few. Never as I care for you, but yes. The curse of immortality is that everyone you love becomes a temporary presence in your existence. It's easier to remain distant, but—" He trailed off, then shook his head. "We should focus on your training." But Ilara wasn't ready to let the subject drop. Through her expanding perceptions, she could sense that his feelings for her were deeper and more complex than simple attraction or even protective instinct. There was something almost like reverence in the way his consciousness touched hers, as if she represented hope for something he had thought lost forever. "What makes me different?" she asked softly. "You challenge me," he replied after a long pause, "not through defiance or political maneuvering, but through your moral clarity. You see situations in terms of right and wrong rather than advantage and disadvantage. It's refreshing after centuries of dealing with beings who always have hidden agendas. Everyone has hidden agendas, even me." "Oh, and what is your hidden agenda?" Ilara met his eyes directly, letting him sense the truth through their connection. "I want to become strong enough to stand beside you as an equal rather than someone you have to protect. I want to help you carry the burden of keeping peace in a world that seems determined to tear itself apart. And I want," she hesitated, then forced herself to continue, "I want to understand what it would mean to love someone who will outlive me by centuries, and whether that kind of love is worth the inevitable pain." The admission hung between them like a bridge that could either bring them closer together or collapse under the weight of its implications. Kieran's emotional state became a storm of conflicting desires, hope warring with fear, love struggling against protective instinct. "Ilara," he said quietly, "you don't understand what you're asking for. Then explain it to me." Loving an immortal means accepting that your entire human lifespan will be perhaps a decade or two in my existence. It means knowing that when you're gone, I'll carry the memory of our time together for centuries or millennia afterward. It means accepting that I've done things in my past that would horrify you, and that I may be forced to do such things again in the future. And loving a human means accepting that I'll grow old while you remain young," Ilara countered. "It means knowing that you'll have to watch me die. It means accepting that my understanding of your world will always be limited by my mortality. Those seem like equally difficult challenges." Kieran stood abruptly, moving to the window despite the heavy curtains that blocked his view. "This conversation is premature. Your abilities are still developing. Your situation is still precarious. Such decisions should wait until you've had time to fully understand what your life as a seer could become." But Ilara could sense that his objections weren't really about timing. They were about fear. Fear of loss. Fear of causing her pain. Fear of allowing himself to hope for something he had convinced himself was impossible. "You're afraid," she said gently. "Of course I'm afraid." He turned back to face her, and for a moment his careful composure cracked, revealing the vulnerability beneath. "I've lived for 8 centuries without allowing myself to truly love someone. The thought of opening myself to that kind of loss again is... again." Kieran closed his eyes, and through their connection, Ilara sensed a wave of ancient grief so profound it left her breathless. There was someone, long ago, a human woman who saw past my nature to something worth caring for. I thought our love could transcend the barriers between our kinds, thought I could protect her from the dangers of my world. What happened to her? She was killed by those who saw our relationship as an abomination, a threat to the natural order. I was younger then, less powerful, unable to prevent it. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I swore afterward that I would never again allow myself such vulnerability. Understanding flooded through Ilara, bringing with it a fierce protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. No wonder he was reluctant to acknowledge what was growing between them. His last attempt at love had ended in tragedy. But she could also sense that his feelings for her were already too deep to ignore, that whether he admitted it or not, his heart had already made its choice. "I'm not her," Ilara said simply. "And you're not the same person you were centuries ago." "No," he agreed, "but the dangers remain. The political situation, the council's ambitions, the awakening of your abilities, Any of these could put you at risk, and if something happened to you because of your association with me, then it would be my choice to take that risk, just as it's my choice to trust you with my safety and my future." They stared at each other across the chamber, the weight of unspoken possibilities heavy in the air between them. Ilara could feel Kieran's internal struggle, the battle between his desire to protect himself from potential loss and his growing need for the connection they shared. The moment was interrupted by a soft chiming sound that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Kieran's expression immediately grew alert, his attention shifting to whatever the sound signified. "What is it?" Ilara asked. "Someone is approaching the mansion, someone with enough power to trigger the warning wards." He moved toward the door, then paused to look back at her. "Stay here. Shield your mind as I taught you, and don't try to extend your perceptions beyond this room." Is it dangerous? Potentially. The wards don't distinguish between friendly and hostile visitors, only between those with significant supernatural power and those without. After he left, Ilara found herself alone with her racing thoughts and the growing certainty that their evening of training had been building towards something more than educational exercises. The conversation about love and loss had revealed depths to both their feelings that she wasn't sure either of them was prepared to confront fully. But perhaps that was the nature of the path she had chosen. Constant challenges to her understanding of herself and her place in the world. Learning to be a seer wasn't just about developing supernatural abilities. It was about expanding her entire conception of what was possible. She tried to follow Kieran's instructions and limit her perceptions to the immediate area, but the urgency she could sense in his emotions made it difficult to resist reaching out to discover what was happening. Instead, she focused on strengthening her mental shields, preparing for whatever complications this new visitor might bring. The wait stretched on for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. When Kieran finally returned, his expression was grim, and she could sense layers of concern and calculation in his emotional state. "Who was it?" she asked immediately. "Marcus Thorne, the arena overseer from last night. It seems he's had second thoughts about accepting my intervention on your behalf." Ilara's blood ran cold. What does that mean? It means he's filed a formal complaint with the Council of Shadows, claiming that my actions constituted an abuse of authority and a violation of established judicial processes. He's demanding that you be returned to face the remainder of your sentence. Can the Council force you to comply? Not directly, but they can make my position increasingly difficult to maintain if they choose to view this as a test of my respect for traditional law and order. Kieran moved to his usual chair, but remained standing, too restless to sit. Marcus didn't come here alone tonight. He brought 2 council members with him, Lord Damien and Councillor Vale from the werewolf clans. What did they want? Officially, to inform me of the formal complaint and request my response. Unofficially, to gauge my commitment to protecting you and determine whether they can use this situation to undermine my authority more broadly. Ilara could sense the political calculations swirling around her like a web she was only beginning to understand. Every action, every decision carried implications that rippled through layers of supernatural politics she had never known existed. What did you tell them? That my authority extends to pardoning those who show exceptional circumstances, and that your case clearly qualifies. But they've made it clear that they intend to press the issue before the full council. When? Tomorrow night. There will be a formal hearing to determine whether my intervention was legitimate or whether you should be returned to face justice according to traditional protocols. The thought of returning to the arena, of enduring the remaining 15 lashes that could easily kill her in her current state, made Ilara's stomach clench with terror. But worse than her own fear was the recognition that this hearing would be as much about Kieran's right to rule as it would be about her fate. They're using me to challenge your authority, she realized. Yes, though I suspect that was their intention from the beginning. Your arrest, the public nature of your punishment, the decision to hold it in the arena where I would be likely to witness it, none of that was accidental. You think they wanted you to intervene? I think they wanted to create a situation where any choice I made would weaken my position. If I had done nothing, they could have painted me as callous toward human suffering, potentially damaging relationships with human settlements. By intervening, I've given them grounds to question my respect for legal traditions and council authority. Elara sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the complexity of the trap that had been laid. She had thought herself a victim of circumstances, but in reality, she had been a pawn in a much larger game. There has to be a way to turn this around, she said, thinking aloud. Some way to make their challenge backfire. I'm open to suggestions, Kieran replied, though his tone suggested he had already considered and discarded numerous possibilities. Elara closed her eyes, reaching out carefully with her enhanced perceptions to sense the emotional undercurrents of the situation. Through their connection, she could feel Kieran's strategic mind working through scenarios, discarding those that involved too much risk to either of them. But there was something else there, something he wasn't considering because it would require trusting her abilities before they were fully developed. What if we use the hearing to demonstrate exactly why my abilities make me valuable rather than dangerous? She suggested slowly. Instead of defending your right to intervene, what if we prove that your intervention was not just justified, but necessary for the greater good? Kieran's attention sharpened. How would we do that? You said a seer can perceive the connections between all living things, can sometimes glimpse possible futures. What if I could demonstrate that my punishment was part of a larger pattern designed to destabilize your rule? What if I could show the council members true motives in ways they couldn't deny or explain away? That would require you to use your abilities in front of hostile witnesses, with no safety net if something goes wrong. If you lost control, if the visions were unclear or misleading, it could make things worse for both of us. But if it worked, it would solve both problems at once, establishing my value as an ally rather than a liability, and exposing the council members' treachery in a way that would strengthen your position. Kieran was quiet for a long moment, and through their connection, Elara could sense him weighing risks and possibilities. The idea appealed to him, she realized, but his protective instincts warred with his strategic calculations. The danger to you would be enormous, he said finally. Using untrained abilities in such a high-stakes situation could damage your mind permanently. And if the council interprets your revelations as an attack, then we make sure they can't, Elara interrupted. We prepare carefully. We practice until I can control the visions reliably, and we present the information in a way that appears objective rather than accusatory. And if your perceptions are wrong, if you see connections that don't exist or misinterpret what you're shown, then we'll face the consequences together. But Kieran, if we do nothing, they win anyway. At least this way, we're fighting back. She could feel his internal struggle, the conflict between his desire to protect her and his recognition that she might be right. Finally, he nodded slowly. If we're going to attempt this, we'll need to spend tomorrow preparing intensively. Your control will need to be much stronger, and you'll need to learn to direct your visions towards specific questions rather than letting them come randomly. Can that be done? In theory, but it's advanced work, the kind of training that usually takes months to develop safely. We'll be compressing it into a single day, which carries its own risks. I can handle it, Elara said, with more confidence than she felt. I have to handle it. They spent the rest of the night working on basic control exercises, pushing Elara's abilities harder than before. By dawn, she could maintain clear perceptions of multiple people's emotional states simultaneously, could direct her consciousness towards specific questions, and could call up visions with increasing reliability. But the work was exhausting, and Kieran's concern for her welfare grew more pronounced as the hours passed. More than once, he insisted on breaks when she pushed herself to the point of collapse, and she could sense his growing doubts about the wisdom of their plan. "Perhaps we should consider other options," he said as the sun began to rise. "I could call in favors from allies on the council, try to build a coalition of support that would make their challenge more difficult, and show weakness in the process," Ilara replied, accepting the glass of water he offered with hands that trembled from exhaustion. "Besides, you said yourself that the political balance is shifting. How many of those allies can you really count on when the stakes are this high?" "Few enough," he admitted. "But at least such an approach wouldn't risk your sanity or your life. Kieran, look at me." She waited until his storm-gray eyes met hers. "I'm not the helpless victim they think I am anymore. I'm not even the same person who was dragged into that arena 2 nights ago. This training, these abilities, they're changing me into someone who can stand beside you as an equal. Trust me to know my own capabilities." Through their connection, she could feel his resistance wavering. He wanted to believe she was strong enough for what they planned, wanted to trust in her growing abilities. But 8 centuries of experience had taught him that power without proper preparation was often more dangerous than helpful. "There's something else," he said finally. "Something I haven't told you about the council hearing." "What?" "It won't just be Lord Damien and Lady Seraphina arguing against my authority. They've convinced 3 other council members to support their position, including Councillor Vale from the werewolf clans and Elder Morrison from the human settlements." Ilara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Dawn heir. "A human is arguing for my punishment?" Elder Morrison has always believed that cooperation with supernatural authorities requires strict adherence to established laws, even when those laws are harsh. He sees your case as a test of whether humans will respect supernatural justice or expect special treatment. The betrayal stung more than Ilara had expected. She had assumed that other humans, especially those in positions of leadership, would sympathize with her situation. To learn that one of them was actively working against her felt like a rejection of everything she had tried to accomplish for her community. "How many council members are there total?" 12. "If 5 are aligned against me, I need at least 7 to maintain my position. Right now, I can count on perhaps 4 with certainty."